So you just want me to talk?
Yes, please.
Some of it may be totally irrelevant to what you want.
Doesn't matter.
This is the Ginkelse Heide in the middle of Holland. It's an area of 8 square miles of moorland next to the national park the Hoge Veluwe. Normally it's peaceful and quiet here, except for one Saturday in September. Every year some 50,000 people gather on this heath to watch the most spectacular part of the commemoration of the battle for Arnhem, the dropping of hundreds of paratroopers. But why here? What happened here in those days in September 1944? This film tells the story of the battle for the Ginkelse Heide, the battle for the drop zone Y in the Market Garden Plan. It's the story of the King's own Scottish borderers, and it's the story of the Dutch Waffen SS battalion from Amersfoort. Most of all, it's the story of the 4th Para Brigade, which landed here on the 18th of September 1944. The story begins in Holland in 1940 when the German paratroopers attacked the city of The Hague.
Junkers die daar heel hoog vlogen. Wij hoorden dus heel in de vette. En we kijken dus naar het strand. En dat was denk ik om 5:30. Het panzerafweer was al op het strand. En die schieten daar 2 Junkers boven de branding kapot. Een vuurzee ter hoogte van een flat. Met 15 man parachutisten en de bemanning weg. En dat heb ik 4 keer gezien. Nou, dat vergeet je nooit. En wij marcheerden naar het vliegveld Valkenburg. Want daar moesten wij gaan vechten. Dus onderweg. Wij zijn beschoten vanaf de lucht. En we zitten met verrekijkers. Hebben we zitten kijken. En dan zie je daar boven dat vliegveld, daarboven dat dorpje Valkenburg, allemaal parachutisten naar beneden. Verschrikkelijk, volop. Nou, wij waren met 150 man en wij kregen order om op te trekken. En wij steken die Katwijkse weg over en wij krijgen een vuurzee vanuit het Panbos. Langs die sloot zijn er een stel Duitsers daarheen gekropen naar dat Panbos. En die hebben zitten wachten tot wij hier zo die weg overstaken. En toen schoten ze 5 piepers tegelijk. 5 piepers, prrr. En die kogels die vlogen over onze kop. Nou, ik lag plat. En ik lag met mijn neus bij de schoenen van Frans Redengeld. En wij liggen daar te liggen en hij gaat overeind om te kijken waar dat vandaan komt. Hij krijgt een kogel hier erin en daar eruit. We zijn daar 's nachts gebleven. We mochten gelukkig terugtrekken, want er was een overmacht van vijand. Er stonden 49 junkers weggezakt. Die konden niet meer op. Daarom gingen ze parachutisten. Gingen ze allemaal met de parachute naar beneden. En ik heb op parachute geschoten ook. Want dit was wel de overeenkomst van Genève dat je moest wachten tot ze op de grond waren. Maar zij schoten terwijl ze nog in de lucht hingen. Ja. Nou ja, dan ga je ook terugschieten. Dus ik heb er wel een paar kapot geschoten op school, als gezegd. Ja, toen kwam dan de capitulatie, gelukkig. Dat was na het bombardement van Rotterdam.
After the surrender of the Dutch forces, the Germans swept through Belgium and France and defeated the French army and the British expeditionary forces in a blitzkrieg of only 6 weeks. The world was astonished. Most people believed that the Germans would rule the European mainland for a number of years. The attack by paratroopers made a deep impact in the free world. It was seen as the new way of warfare. The surprise attack and the seemingly easy victories in Holland and in Belgium convinced the British and the American army that parachute infantry was very useful in the forthcoming war in Europe. So they formed their own parachute regiments.
Well, just to introduce myself, I was a regular officer just before the war and stationed out in India. And in 1941 came the call to form a parachute battalion, and I was lucky to be accepted. And we trained in India for about a year, but we returned to England just at the beginning of 1944.
My name is George Barton, and I was a sergeant in the King's Own Scottish Borders, 7th Battalion. I joined the army at the beginning of the war in a regiment called the Yorks and Lancs. We were stationed at Plymouth, that's where I did my training. And it was while we were here that we found out we were going to be airborne and we were going to fly in gliders.
The Germans, however, looked at the downside. Heavy casualties and the loss of many airplanes convinced Hitler that paratroopers had no future of their own in the Wehrmacht. But the airborne warfare looked great in the German newsreels. The German propaganda made a fine show of the attacks, mainly by leaving out the truth. Virtually nobody knows, even today, that the Dutch army imprisoned over 1,500 highly trained paratroopers and shipped them out to England in the evening of May 15, 1940. When even a small and poorly armed Dutch army could beat the Fallschirmjäger, they wouldn't be a match for better prepared forces. Soon after the occupation of Holland, it was back to normal for the Dutch. The Germans saw the Dutch as potential allies and acted accordingly. Furthermore, the economy in Holland was booming, and for the first time in 20 years, there was hardly any unemployment. The Dutch Nazi movement, the NSB, supported the aggressive German politics, and as early as the summer of 1940, the first Dutch volunteers left for Germany. In 1941, the Germans launched the attack on Russia and called it a crusade against communism. The numbers of volunteers soared. Most of them went to Russia, but some served in Holland itself.
Er lag volk en vaderland lag op tafel. Ja? Dat was het lijfblad van de NSB. En er stond op, een man met een helm op de kop, weet je wel, militair, hè? Zo, met een helm op de kop. Hè? En daar stond er een verhaaltje bij. Zij zochten Germaanse jongens. Jongens met blauwe ogen en blond haar. Nou, ik zag me er helemaal in, jongen. Ha, ik was die jongen, die Germaanse, blond haar, blauwe ogen. Ik was er 1,75 meter. Precies aan alle dingen voldaan, hè. Precies zoals ik dat graag wou. Dat was in april 42, geloof ik. En ik zei, ik ga naar de Waffen-SS. Ik zit in mijn zuster Tini en Dirkje, mijn verloofde. Ik zei, breng maar even de fiets naar Wieringen. Ik zei, dan gaat met het trein naar Amersfoort.
In 1943 heb ik getekend voor de Nederlandse Waffen-SS. Ik werd naar Amersfoort gestuurd naar het zogeheten kamp Amsvoorde. Kamp Amsvoorde is een groot militair terrein, onder andere de Leusderhei en Don Bosco en ook het kamp Amersfoort. Ja, natuurlijk wisten wij wat daar gebeurde, want wij stonden boven in die torens en dan kon je alles zien. Op het terrein zelf, nee, daar mochten we niet komen, want dat werd helemaal gerund door de SD. En die wilden absoluut niet dat wij op dat terrein kwamen. Mijn naam is Hans van Nijstein en de mensen noemen mij Haan. Ja, in het begin was het eigenlijk een gemakkelijk baantje en dat trok ook gemakkelijke mensen aan. Maar eind 1943, begin 1944 was het wel duidelijk dat we bij de Waffen-SS zaten en toen werden de trainingen opgevoerd.
Heel lang, al van mars, dan moest ik kruipen door de grond, rappen door de grond, over de grond heen. En dan kwam ik naar die bossen en dan moest je door die bossen nemen, de modder in kruipen. Want dein geweer darf niet das werden. Dein geweer is dein bruid. Ja, dat is mijn verloofde.
D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, changed the war in Western Europe decisively. It was the largest seaborne operation ever. It was spearheaded by the British and the American paratroopers. It would become their moment of fame. Most of the operations were a great success, like for instance the capturing of the bridge in Ranville, the destruction of the big guns in Merville, and the capturing of Saint-Mère-Église. But their main contribution was the fact that the paratroopers were scattered all over the Normandy countryside, creating chaos in the German line of command, preventing an immediate response or even a counterattack. After fierce combat for several months around the hedges of Normandy, the Allies broke through the German lines and liberated France and Belgium in a matter of weeks. The Dutch expected their liberation any day now. After a radio broadcast from England by Queen Wilhelmina addressing the Dutch people, the Germans, occupying Holland and their Dutch henchmen panicked and fled to Germany. This Tuesday is called Dolle Dinsdag or Mad Tuesday. However, in the first days of September the Allied supply chain broke down. It was impossible to supply every Allied division. The so-called Red Bull Highway came to a standstill.
Although we stood by as reserve for the Normandy landings, we were not used. And during that summer, we stood to and prepared for about 15 different operations, but all of them were cancelled. The last one, our brigade was to take Grave Bridge in Operation Comet.
At that moment, the Allied Supreme Commander, Eisenhower, had to choose between two options. Stop the offensive and resupply, the so-called broad front strategy, or combine the available supplies for just one attempt on a small front.
As I said, Montgomery was finally given the extra airborne support of the Airborne Army, which is all the aircraft, 3 divisions, 2 American and our British division with Polish brigade. So Operation Comet was cancelled, thank God. which would have been a shambles, and Operation Market Garden was planned.
The main idea was to drop or to land 3 airborne divisions, 2 American divisions and 1 British with a Polish brigade. The Americans to capture the bridges from Eindhoven up what became known to them as Hell's Highway. The 82nd Airborne Division to capture the bridges from Grave to Nijmegen and to hold the Groesbeek Heights. And finally, the British Airborne Division with the Poles to capture and hold the bridges at Arnhem.
The airborne forces were to capture no less than 17 bridges in Holland, forming a corridor or a highway to the north for the British Second Army. In that way, the Allied forces could cross the River Rhine and would avoid a direct assault on the German defences at their western border. After crossing the Rhine at Arnhem, the bridgehead would be used to encircle the German war effort in the Ruhr area. There is little doubt that if these objectives would have been met, the war would have been over in a few months. The Market Garden Plan was accepted by Eisenhower, and all available supplies in the forces of the Allied air power was shifted to the British theatre of operation at the Dutch border. It was a very risky operation. First of all, it was put together in only a few days. The planners used a blueprint from the Operation Comet and adapted it for a much bigger operation. Secondly, there were not enough airplanes to fly the airborne troops over in one lift. This meant that the landing and drop zones had to be secured in order to use them for a second and a third time. Therefore, after the first lift, a large number of soldiers were used to protect and hold the drop zones, thus reducing the attack force itself. Thirdly, there was the timetable. Montgomery assumed that these ground forces could reach the Arnhem Bridge in no more than 2 days. In order to do so, every bridge required to get to Arnhem had to be taken within the time window available. Furthermore, the airborne forces had to keep the corridor open in spite of German counterattacks. The success of an airborne assault is very much depending on the element of surprise. This means that a so-called coup de main is needed for the major targets. The Air Force, however, refused to fly over areas which they expected to be full of flak. They decided to only use safe drop zones, despite the fact that these drop zones were more than 8 miles from the bridge. Sunday, September 17, was set as the starting point of the operation.
As I said, we'd done it so many times, the different operations, and the men were getting a bit blasé about it. Oh, this is going to be cancelled again.
Once we got within maybe an hour of going, we were getting ready to go to the airfield, and it was cancelled. So we were used to this on and off business all the time. We didn't really believe we was going to go this time, to be quite honest, because it happened so many times. And then this time it's for real, we had to get up and go. This is the runway here, you can see way in the distance, we were right down there. The Dakotars lined up on the outside with their engines roaring. The noise was terrific. In between were the gliders. I was the number 3 one to go off, and I was worried about the takeoff because I had the heaviest weight on board, and I was worried if we was going to get airborne before we hit the end of this runway. But of course we did, otherwise I wouldn't be here now. So we made it and we went over that direction, over the road, heading west, before we formed up, turned east again to go to Holland.
On the first day, we were due to come in on the second day, and suddenly on that Sunday, we heard the noise of a mass of aircraft, and we saw them flying overhead, circling like that, enormous formations of American aircraft, and a great cheer went up from our soldiers. The operation was obviously on.
First the bombers came. At 11:30 a.m. they arrived in the skies over several cities in Holland, among them the town of Ede.
Ja, het was schitterend, schitterend weer. En ja, goed, het was zo 11:30 denk ik zo ongeveer. En nou, het begon toch eigenlijk, ja, vliegtuigen. Ja, goed, je was wel vliegtuigen gewend. En, nou, en toen hoorde je dreunen en dreunen. Toen zeiden we, nou, toen ging het luchtalarm af. Dus ja, wat moest je? Naar de kelder. En we hadden een kelder die goedgekeurd was door de luchtbeschermingsdienst. En nou ja, je hoorde wel bonken, dat heet het. Nou, je wist gewoon niet, nou, je was zo bang als ik weet niet wat, want ja, ja, misschien krijg je zelf ook een bom op je huis.
The bombing was partly successful. Objectives like the railroad and the military facilities at Ede barracks were hit, causing major damages and killing 22 Germans. The collateral damage was high. A number of houses, shops, factories, a school and a church were hit, causing severe loss of life. 64 dead and many more wounded. At 9:45 a.m. the first lift of the airborne forces took off. The largest air armada ever, 1,500 troop carriers, 500 tug planes with gliders and over 900 fighter planes. The attack came as a complete surprise to the Germans. No flak and no German fighters appeared in the sky. However, due to technical failures and accidents in the air, a number of airplanes and gliders were damaged, had to return to England, or, even worse, crashed into the sea. Just after 1 o'clock, the gliders arrived at their landing zones. Only half an hour later, the paratroopers were dropped at Arnhem. The first lift was a complete success. The King's own Scottish borderers arrived in their gliders and immediately started unloading their equipment. They were assigned to defend drop zone Y, the Ginkelse Heide. This was planned to be the drop zone of 4th Parabrigade, due to come in the next day. The A Company took off first. Their strong point was here at the Planken Bambuis Café. Their objective was to block the road to Arnhem, preventing the Germans to resupply. Half an hour later, the B and C Company arrived at their positions west of the Ginkelse Heide. They were deployed in the so-called Seiselt woods. B Company deployed an anti-tank gun in order to control the main road heading for Arnhem. The headquarters and the D Company were deployed on the south side of the Heath, just along the highway A12. Later that afternoon, D Company was ordered to take positions near the Weideveld barracks in order to prevent the Germans occupying them and control the drop zones from there. The Scottish were ordered not to move nor to attack the Germans in order to keep their positions covered. The drop zones were located over 8 miles from the bridge. Because the drop itself was during daylight, the Germans would very soon figure out the overall plan. Therefore, the British deployed a specially equipped attack force with heavily armed jeeps. They were to race to the bridge and secure it before the Germans could respond. In the meantime, the first major problem emerged. First of all, the appearance of the German SS company, commanded by Sepp Kraft, in the Wolfhezer woods, halted the British attack force. Kraft was at location for a training mission and actually saw the landing happening. He immediately formed a blocking line along the railroad in Wolfhezer. Heavy fire from machine guns and mortars stopped the British advance, and the last element of surprise was gone. It was now only the 2nd Battalion, commanded by John Frost, who could reach the bridge before the Germans were able to secure it. In the Arnhem region, the British, learned that they landed on top of 2 SS Panzerdivisionen. These 9th and 10th SS divisions had escaped from France and were withdrawn to be refitted in order to take part in the defense of Germany and the offensive in the Ardennes later that year. Field Marshal Model stayed at the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek and commanded the German response. Finally, the radios were not working.
I couldn't speak to my boss or another company. It just didn't work. And I think that's where the breakdown comes about, that we didn't know what others were doing in relation to us.
In general, the Germans were an experienced fighting force. From the battlefields in Russia and in France, they learned how to respond in times of crisis like this. Every available German soldier was reassigned into so-called alarm companies and were sent into battle. One of the units ordered in was the Dutch SS battalion from Amersfoort.
Toen de orders kwamen om op te rukken naar Wolfhezen op die zondag de 17e, zo ergens in de loop van de middag, was ik net teruggekomen uit Dachau, waar ik een aantal gevangenen naartoe had gebracht. We kregen orders om op te rukken in de richting van Arnhem. Wij werden als kampfgroepen ingezet onder leiding van Paul Helle. Paul Helle was onze commandant en het was een Oostenrijkse nazi en wij dachten altijd dat hij een leuk baantje in Nederland had gekregen. Wij moesten lopen, dus degene die het snelst op weg waren, en dat is een afstand van zo'n 20-25 kilometer, dat was het jachtcommando. Het jachtcommando die hadden fietsen en dat was in feite in die tijd de enige manier van transport die we nog over hadden.
A Company ambushed the SS Wheel Riders Company at the tree line next to the Ginkelse Café. They caused heavy casualties.
Nou, dat jachtcommando dat was er zwaar aan toe. Die hadden heel wat slachtoffers. En de rest was, laten we zeggen, zo geschrokken dat de meesten er vandoor gingen. Maar de paar die terugkwamen, die vertelden dat er een hinderlaag lag en dat ze verder eigenlijk niemand gezien hadden. Nou, meneer Helle was de enige die verlof had op die dag, terwijl toch alle verloven waren ingetrokken. Dus luitenant Barts die had het commando en die zei van nou ja, we blijven eerst zitten bij de Langeberg. In de eerste plaats kunnen we daar heel goed zien hoe de hei erbij ligt. Want in die tijd waren daar geen bomen en we zagen eigenlijk niks. En later hoorden we natuurlijk dat we het Market Garden plan in handen hadden gekregen en dat de hei bestemd was voor de landing op de tweede dag. En toen was het wel duidelijk wat de bedoeling was. Toen we een tijdje gekeken hadden en nog steeds geen enkele beweging zagen, moesten we toch weten waar we aan toe waren en werd er een patrouille uitgestuurd. Die liep een tijdje over de hei en na een uur of wat kwamen ze terug en toen meldden ze dat ze helemaal niets gezien hadden. En eerst konden we dat niet geloven, maar toen we de hele hei zagen en een enorme oppervlakte, ja, toen was wel duidelijk dat het moeilijk zou zijn om uit te zoeken waar de parachutisten precies zaten. En nog steeds was meneer Helle niet gearriveerd, maar die kwam in de loop van de avond en die hoorde het rapport van Bartsch aan en die besloot om het hoofdkwartier dat wij hadden ingericht op de Langeberg te verplaatsen naar het café op de Ginkel. En dat was een briljante zet, want op dat punt kon je de hele hei prima overzien. En dat betekent dat als het zou worden gebruikt voor de landingen, dat we de hele landingszone onder vuur zouden kunnen nemen.
In the dark, the King's own Scottish borderers used flares to have a clear sight, preventing the SS infiltrating their lines of defense. The Germans, however, sent out patrols and small alarm companies to look for the paratroopers and try to overrun them.
En Helle had het plan opgevat om te kijken of we een kruisvuur zouden kunnen leggen over de hei. En dat betekent dat je een van de twee andere kanten ook in een vast punt moet hebben. En hij besloot om eens te kijken hoe het erbij lag bij de barakken die werden gebruikt voor de arbeiders die werkten aan de bouw van de snelweg A12. Het zogeheten Weideveld. En midden in de nacht stuurden we er een versterkt peloton op af. En na een fix gevecht slaagden we erin om het steunpunt wat de parachutisten daar hadden ingericht te veroveren.
One attack on the Weide barracks succeeded. The SS took over the barracks and moreover they captured more than 50 British.
Wij, het wachtbataljon uit Amersfoort, hadden 50 Engelse parachutisten gevangen genomen. Toen dachten we echt dat we de slag op de Ginkelse Heide gewonnen hadden. We gingen via de Ginkelse herberg naar Ede en hebben ze daar in de gevangenis gestopt.
Ja, je zag wel een keer als de Duitsers van bij ons zo van de Kilsweg naar beneden kwamen, dus van de Oude Rijksweg af. Die hebben toch even een andere man bij de... Ja, dan bleek dat weer dat het een Engelsman was die ze gevangen genomen had op de hei natuurlijk.
We was told not to trust the Dutch people, to be quite honest. And I was a bit worried about that because when we was in the shop, you know, with the gun, every night when the firing stopped, a lot of Dutch people would go up to, there was a water pump in the next road, Paul Krugerstraat. It's not there now, but that time it was a ham, and they were going up there for water. And I didn't like that because they would go back the other way, and they could easily be telling the Germans where we were. You had to trust them. But we were told not to trust them because there was one or two Dutchmen who were in with the Germans, as it were.
At 11 o'clock that morning, the supposed drop time, the skies were clear. No sign of the 4th Spare Brigade. There was a delay, but on the Ginkelse Heide nobody knew when or if at all the brigade was coming. The situation was risky and the King's own Scottish borderers decided to use their heavier arms.
When it became daylight and I could still see movement on the road, but Major Foreman asked me not to engage with these targets because if I fired the gun it would give our position away. So we had to keep quiet. Later in the day he told me there had been a delay from England and therefore as targets presented themselves I should engage them. So first of all we had a start car come along. So we engaged that and hit it, put it out of action. We did this subsequently for other lorries and things that come along that road.
Toen we terugkwamen waren de gevechten opgeleid op de Ginkelse Heide, dus we kwamen niet verder dan de Ginkelse herberg.
We were briefed for an early morning takeoff. We'd leave our billets at midnight. Anyway, about 2 hours before midnight came a delay of 4 hours or 6 hours because of the weather. But you know, in September, everything, the mist comes down and the aircraft, they could take off, but they couldn't formate in these big formations. So we took off from Saltby in these American aircraft. Then as we came over the Dutch coast, we met the first flak, not much of it. And for the next 10 minutes or so, we flew over flooded fields. And I remember 2 farmhouses. The family were on the roof, about a dozen of them. And there they were on the roof, surrounded by floods. When they waved us, and I could wave out of the window. And as we got near a town, forget my Dutch pronunciation, Hertzigenbosch. And it was from there that the flak started. I was standing in the door and leaning forward. I could see all these formations of aircraft in front of me, and occasionally you saw these black puffs of flak like that, and they seemed to hang in the air, and suddenly they pass you like that. And as I was standing in the door, apparently the aircraft just to starboard of me got a direct hit, and it passed, it burst into flame immediately, and it passed under the door of my aircraft like that, and I watched it go down, and it hit port wing down, and it just rolled over like that, a big whoosh of white flame. That was half our machine gun platoon, but 19 men and all the crew. As I said, after the aircraft stream crossed the IP, they closed up into this very close formation and started to come down from 1,500 feet to 700 feet, which is the drop height.
The Germans held their positions at the Ginkelse Café and the Weideveld barracks. This was a major threat to the British paratroopers landing in the afternoon. When the noise of the airlift was heard, the King's Own Scottish borderers attacked. The 10th Battalion supported them right after landing on the north side of the Heath.
There was spasmodic firing over the Heath from far side where A Company and C Company were, shooting going on all the time. And then towards the south I could hear and see then the 156 Battalion coming in, and they come forward and we were so pleased to see them.
Red light went on, which is a stand to the door, and I couldn't see the red and green lights were just by the side of the door, but here I couldn't see them because the sun was shining through like that onto them. Anyhow, the whole of my stick behind me saw it, and they were so eager to get out with a great shout, go, and I was out.
In the next 14 minutes, over 2,000 paratroopers were dropped on the Ginkelse Heide. It was an amazing sight.
Ja, we hoorden de vliegtuigen aankomen. Ja, en wat we toen totaal niet verwacht hadden, is dat de Engelsen frontaal in de aanval gingen op onze posities. Nee, we konden ze even tegenhouden. En bij het café ging het eigenlijk de eerste aanleg wel goed. Maar toen de landingen zelf kwamen, en ja, toen ging Helle als eerste er vandoor. Ja, en toen was er geen houden meer aan natuurlijk.
We remember Ginkelse Heath particularly because it was really the first massed parachute jump under opposition, which was successfully carried out. So this was the first occasion when about 140 aircraft flew in close formation to drop a whole parachute brigade.
It's quite an impressive sight. We hadn't taken part in one of these mass drops before. The aircraft was streaming over us, one after one, with lots of men coming down.
The fact we saw them coming was immensely gratitude to us, because this is what we wanted to do, get them down so we could get on. So we were highly delighted that at last they turned up. Better late than never.
And we had advance parties of each battalion, 19 men who dropped on the first day. And their job was to, when we came in, was to mark the rendezvous with coloured smoke. The major of our advance party was already there, and I came up fairly soon, coming up the western edge like that, and he'd been waiting there for about 4 or 5 hours. He was a big Scotsman, big moustaches, and he welcomed me and said, "You're bloody late." The majority of the battalion was there within 45 minutes, which is quite good, considering, I mean, I was lucky, I was on the western side, I could run straight up, but some of the men were way over on the eastern side as well, and there were men going from crisscrossing. There were quite a few of our men who were wounded, were shot coming down. One of my young platoon commanders, who had been, when we were waiting to take off, I'd been sitting in the grass with him talking. He was either shot in the door or coming down, and he had a phosphorus grenade. We all had phosphorus grenades here, and he was hit the phosphorus grenade, and of course it burnt him. And he was all shot in the leg, so he couldn't move. And after the war, his family kept asking me what happened to him. So I couldn't tell him, so I tell them. So just said he was shot on the dropping zone. Up at Ginkelse Cafe was also charged in looking after the wounded, because our field ambulance set up a dressing station. There's a sheep barn up there, isn't there? When we started moving, already it lost 10% of its strength before the battle started. And as you know, our brigadier was met on the track as he arrived at the rendezvous by his brigade major, that is senior staff officer, who had landed the day before, and also met by the G1 of the division. He was a senior staff officer from Div HQ, and they had come from Wolfhazer, walked up there to tell the brigadier that the general was missing. We don't know where he is. We don't know what's happening in Arnhem. So our brigadier very quickly on the air sent a message to all the units: stay in position. So we stayed in our rendezvous positions whilst they worked out a new plan. And he'd had a row because there was an order given to him by the acting divisional commander that his 11th Battalion will be dispatched at once to join the 1st Brigade in Arnhem.
The 11th Battalion took off first and succeeded in reaching the outskirts of Arnhem. They were stopped by the Germans at the St. Elizabeth Hospital, a few miles from the bridge.
Brigadier Hackett made out a quick change of plan. He said to the G1 division, "You don't know what's happening. What I'm going to do is to advance my brigade along the railway towards Arnhem in hopes of meeting the rest of the division."
Well, when the action was over, 156 moved off first, and then subsequently we followed them, still covered in smoke off the Heath, still alight. We went down to the south part where we mixed up with C Company, tried to form a battalion with what was left of D Company. No A Company, of course, they was at the other side of the Heath, and they went down the Amsterdam way on their own style. So it was only like 3 companies went along north side of the railway towards Johannesburg, which was our next part of call, because we had to protect that area then for the Polish gliders landing the next day.
It was getting dark by the time our battalion 156 were on the railway line, the long railway line, and that's where we picked up our 10 jeeps and trailers. And just as it was dark, our leading company came up in opposition just west of the Oosterbeek station. And we didn't know the enemy, that was the northern part of their blocking line.
When it became apparent that the advance was stopped, Brigadier Hackett went to the Hartenstein Hotel to work out a new plan.
And the new plan, unfortunately, with hindsight, was to press on along the railway line at first light, which by that time, unbeknownst to the blocking line along the, what's that road, Drensjefek, had been reinforced They had stopped the first parachute battalion on the first night, and there was about 250 men with about half a dozen tanks or armoured cars. And they reinforced it. By the time they came up, there was about 500 strong with about 20, 25 armoured vehicles all the way along there. So that was the idea of the plan. We would come right through those woods and come in north of the railway and hopefully push in. But of course we didn't know that down in St Elizabeth, in that area, 1st Brigade were being cut to pieces. We started marching up the road, but because we got shot at, so we had to go behind the houses. And the difficulty was climbing these bloody fences with all our equipment on, and weapons, etc. And the next house was an old couple having breakfast. I got note, the night before there'd been a battle all the way around that house, and some of the houses were burning. They were sitting down having breakfast in the kitchen. So I said, sorry. I went upstairs and up in the attic, and by the time I came back, well, this old couple had been having breakfast. There was a bloody great hole in the wall, a tank shell had gone right through, and hopefully they were down in the cellar. And our brigadier had just been talking to our commanding officer, and apparently he had impressed on our commanding officer speed. You must get into the bridge. And to a degree, this is probably the reasons for our failure to get any further, because we, to a certain extent, abandoned proper tactics for speed. Anyway, the commanding officer said to me, A Company have put in an attack, and they are across the road. Will you follow through onto Lichtenby and carry on? So those are my orders. I started off with a move towards the Dranscheweg, then move up onto Lichtenby, then give out further orders. As I got nearer, the bodies lying on either side of the track, carriers, these little track vehicles that landed by the big gliders, they passed coming back with wounded stacked on them. I got up within about 100 yards of the Dranscheweg. There's an open, they'd cut down there, and I passed on the track there behind a pile of logs. The whole of the platoon quarters dead, A Company. There was a lot of fire coming from the Dranscheweg from what appeared were twin-barrel 20mm flak guns. 80 yards in front of me on the Dranscheweg, I saw one of the vehicles that was doing the damage, this 20mm thing. And foolishly, as a company commander, I should have been commanding my company. I went forward with 2 of my soldiers and this officer, and we got within 10 yards of it. And I instructed the man on my right to fling a phosphorus grenade. But just as he was about to throw it, he was shot straight through the head like this. And what I hadn't realized was a little man up in the tree protecting him. And he shot me. And I don't know, I must have collapsed. I came to, I don't know how long, and I started to crawl out, and the bullet went just beside me. He was still up there. And so I sort of lay down for a bit, and suddenly bursting through the bushes was a tall Rhodesian soldier I had in my company. Amusing character, but one of the troublemakers. But anyway, he just picked me up and said, "Come on, Major, I'm taking you back." And he carried me back about 100 yards and dumped me. And I might say that was the end of my active battle.
When the first of several attacks on the Johannahoeve failed, the battle for the Ginkelse Heide in fact was over. The second lift could have made the difference, but only when the advance towards Arnhem would have been successful. The reinforced German blocking lines meant that the 4th Para-Brigade could not break through, and they had to concentrate on the protection of the Polish gliders arriving the next day. They succeeded in doing so, and after harsh fighting, the remains of the brigade reached the Oosterbeek perimeter.